wedding invitation. Curious circumstances that were to unfold at Wisteria House during that fateful summer of 1936 began, as so many significant affairs do, with what appeared to be the most innocent of social communications. The wedding invitation of Miss Helena Mallory arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, bearing all the hallmarks of a conventional society function, yet destined to embroil my friend Hercule Poirot and myself in circumstances of the most extraordinary and sinister nature. I had known the Mallory family for several years, my acquaintance dating back to my military service, when duty had occasionally brought me to their Hampshire estate. The invitation itself was elegant in its simplicity, printed on the finest cream paper with tasteful script announcing the forthcoming nuptials of Miss Helena to one Mr. Richard Thornton, a name that struck me as vaguely familiar, though I could not immediately place its origin. "A wedding, Hastings?" inquired Poirot, observing my puzzled expression as I examined the elegant script. My friend had emerged from his bedroom with his customary precision, every detail of his appearance attending to his exacting standards, from the perfect symmetry of his moustache to the immaculate arrangement of his morning attire. "Indeed, Poirot. Miss Helena Mallory, you may recall my mentioning the family some years ago when I was stationed in Hampshire, the Mallorys of Wisteria House." I passed him the invitation, watching as his keen green eyes examined not merely the text, but the paper itself, the quality of the printing, and even the manner in which the envelope had been addressed. "Ah, oui, the military connection," he murmured, his fingers turning the card with characteristic care. "The family with the interesting history, n'est-ce pas? The father who made his fortune in railways, if I recall your previous accounts correctly." My memory stirred at his words. "Quite right. Sir James Mallory, a self-made man who purchased the estate in the 1890s, rather looked down upon by the older county families initially, though his wealth and Helena's remarkable beauty have since secured their position in local society." I paused, considering the implications of the invitation. "I must confess I'm rather surprised to receive this. It's been several years since I've had any correspondence with Helena, though I do recall hearing talk in London legal circles about her attachment to a promising young barrister." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "This would be the Mr. Thornton mentioned in the invitation? Tell me, mon ami, what manner of young lady is Miss Helena Mallory?" I found myself reflecting upon my previous encounters with the Mallory family, particularly the occasions when duty had brought me to their Hampshire estate. "She is how shall I put it, a striking woman. Dark hair, quite beautiful, with rather intense eyes that suggest depths one might not immediately expect. There was always something slightly mysterious about her, though I attributed that to the natural reserve of a young woman of her position." I hesitated, searching for the precise words to convey my impressions. "She possessed an intelligence that was perhaps more keen than conventionally feminine, if I may express it thus. Her conversation suggested interests beyond the usual occupations of county society." "Intriguing," observed Poirot, his tone suggesting genuine interest. "And this prospective bridegroom? You mentioned legal circles?" "Richard Thornton has made quite a name for himself as a barrister, particularly in commercial cases involving international trade. I believe he's associated with chambers that handle considerable South American business, Argentina, Brazil, and the like. A rising star by all accounts, though I've never met him personally." Poirot handed the invitation back to me with a thoughtful expression. "The venue, I observe, is to be the family home, Wisteria House. Such arrangements often prove most illuminating, as they reveal much about family dynamics and social relationships." "You speak as though you were considering attending," I remarked, somewhat surprised. My friend was not generally inclined towards social gatherings, finding them tedious unless they presented some particular point of interest. But of course, Hastings, the invitation extends to both of us, does it not? And you have spoken so eloquently of the beauty of the Hampshire countryside in summer. Besides, he added with that slight smile that often preceded his most perceptive observations, weddings are occasions when people reveal their true natures, the emotions run high, old relationships surface, and new alliances form. Most educational, I find, for one who interests himself in the study of human nature. I found myself warming to the prospect. The summer had been unusually quiet, and the thought of a few days in the countryside, surrounded by the genteel society of a country wedding, held considerable appeal. The estate itself is quite remarkable, I continued, my enthusiasm growing. The house dates from the Georgian period, though Sir James made extensive improvements when he acquired it, and the gardens, particularly in June, are said to be among the finest in the county. The wisteria for which the house is named covers the entire south facade in a cascade of purple blooms. Then it is settled, declared Poirot with characteristic finality. We shall attend this wedding, and I shall have the opportunity to observe the young lady who has so captured your descriptive powers, as well as this successful barrister who has won her hand. As I penned our acceptance that afternoon, I found myself anticipating the journey with genuine pleasure. The prospect of witnessing Helena's happiness, of meeting her accomplished husband-to-be, and of renewing acquaintance with the Mallory family struck me as a welcome diversion from our usual London routine. My only slight concern arose from certain half-remembered conversations in my club, where Thornton's name had been mentioned in connection with some rather complex international business dealings that had required delicate handling by the authorities. Yet such matters seemed entirely removed from the pleasant social occasion that awaited us. Little did I suspect, as I sealed the envelope containing our gracious acceptance, that this seemingly innocent social engagement would soon entangle us in circumstances that would test even Poirot's remarkable powers of deduction, and that the beautiful Wisteria house would become the setting for a mystery that would challenge our understanding of human nature itself. Chapter 2. Arrivals and First Impressions. The journey to Hampshire proved as delightful as I had anticipated, the countryside presenting itself in that particular glory that marks the English summer at its most benevolent. Poirot, seated beside me in the railway carriage, observed the passing landscape with that peculiar intensity he brought to all forms of human endeavour, as though each hedgerow and cottage might yield some insight into the national character. His travelling costume was, as always, impeccable, every detail from his patent leather shoes to his precisely knotted tie reflecting that obsession with order which marked his approach to both personal presentation and criminal investigation. "You observe, Hastings," he remarked, as our train drew into the local station, "how the very architecture of this region speaks to the English desire for permanence and tradition. These buildings, they do not merely shelter, they make statements about their inhabitants' place in the social order." Indeed, as our hired motor car wound through the village lanes toward Wisteria House, I found myself reflecting upon the truth of his observation. The cottages and manor houses we passed seemed to embody centuries of careful cultivation, each generation adding its own refinements while preserving the essential character that marked this corner of England as distinctly civilized. Wisteria House itself exceeded even my fond recollections. The Georgian facade rose before us with that perfect symmetry which so appealed to architectural sensibilities of its era, while the magnificent wisteria vines that gave the house its name cascaded across the southern wall in a spectacular display of purple blooms. The approach drive curved through landscape gardens that spoke of both considerable expense and exquisite taste, with specimen trees and carefully tended flower beds creating vistas of remarkable beauty. "Mon Dieu," murmured Poirot, as our conveyance drew to a halt before the main entrance. "One comprehends immediately why such properties inspire both admiration and, perhaps, certain less noble emotions." Our reception proved as warm as the June sunshine that bathed the estate. Sir James Mallory, though advanced in years, retained the vigorous bearing that had no doubt contributed to his remarkable rise from humble origins to his current position among the landed gentry. His handshake was firm, his manner cordial without being effusive, and his evident pleasure in our attendance struck me as entirely genuine. "Captain Hastings, how delightful to see you again after all these years," he declared, his voice carrying traces of the northern accent he had never entirely abandoned, despite his elevation in society. "And this must be the famous Monsieur Poirot of whom we have heard such remarkable accounts." Lady Mallory, a woman of perhaps 55 years, who had clearly once possessed considerable beauty, greeted us with that particular grace which marks the accomplished hostess. Her attention to detail in the arrangements was evident everywhere, from the perfectly appointed guest chambers to which we were shown, to the subtle coordination of floral displays throughout the public rooms. But it was Helena herself who commanded my immediate attention as we gathered for tea on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The years had refined rather than diminished her striking appearance, and I found myself somewhat disconcerted by the intensity of her dark eyes as she welcomed us to her family home. There was about her an air of barely controlled excitement that seemed to transcend mere bridal anticipation, a quality that suggested depths of feeling or perhaps anxiety that conventional social discourse could not entirely contain. "Captain Hastings," she said, extending a graceful hand, "how kind of you to travel such a distance for my wedding. I confess I had wondered whether our old acquaintance would prove sufficient inducement." "My dear Miss Mallory, or perhaps I should say, soon to be Mrs. Thornton, the pleasure is entirely mine. May I present my friend, Monsieur Hercule Poirot?" Poirot executed one of his characteristic formal bows, his manner conveying both respect and that subtle assessment which he brought to all new encounters. "Mademoiselle, I am enchanted. Your reputation for beauty, it precedes you, but the reality, she surpasses all expectation." Helena's laugh held a note that might have been nervousness. "You are too kind, Monsieur Poirot, though I suspect a gentleman of your remarkable powers of observation sees far more than mere surface appearances." As the afternoon progressed, I found myself cataloguing the various wedding guests who had gathered for the celebration. The prospective bridegroom, Richard Thornton, proved to be a pleasant young man of perhaps 32 years, possessing that easy confidence which marks the successful barrister. His background, as Helena explained during our conversation, was thoroughly respectable. The son of a county judge, educated at Winchester and Oxford, with chambers in Lincoln's Inn specializing in commercial law. Richard and I met through mutual acquaintances in London legal circles, Helena confided as we strolled through the rose garden. I was quite taken with his intelligence and his knowledge of international commerce. We discovered a shared fascination with the complexities of South American trade relationships. Yet something in her manner suggested undercurrents she could not quite articulate, a quality that reminded me of her earlier mysterious air. Poirot, I noticed, observed these subtle indications with his customary attention to psychological nuance. The wedding party itself comprised a mixture of London legal society and local Hampshire gentry, creating that particular social atmosphere which marks significant country house gatherings. Gerald Fenton, the bridegroom's best man, distinguished himself immediately through his jovial manner and evident popularity among both groups. A man of perhaps 35 years, possessed of that hearty good humor which makes such individuals welcome in any company, he seemed to serve as a natural bridge between the sometimes awkward divisions of provincial and metropolitan society. "Capital fellow, Gerald," Richard remarked to me as we observed his animated conversation with several local worthies. "We've been friends since Oxford, though he's made rather more of himself in commercial circles than I have in legal ones. Quite the entrepreneur, with interests extending to South America and beyond." The evening's festivities concluded with informal musical entertainment in the drawing-room, Helena displaying her considerable skill at the pianoforte, while various guests contributed songs and recitations. Throughout these proceedings I observed Poirot's careful attention to the social dynamics unfolding before us, the subtle alliances and gentle tensions that mark any gathering where diverse personalities converge for ceremonial purposes. As I retired to my chamber that night, the sounds of the Hampshire countryside drifting through the open windows, I reflected upon the genuine pleasure this social interlude promised to provide. The wedding preparations appeared to be proceeding with admirable smoothness. The various participants seemed genuinely fond of one another, and the setting could hardly have been more delightful. Yet I could not entirely dismiss a faint sense of unease that had begun to trouble me, something in Helena's manner, perhaps, or in the overly careful way certain topics of conversation were avoided when business matters arose during the evening's discussions. Chapter 3. An Unwelcome Guest. The second day of our residence at Wisteria House dawned with that particular brilliance which marks the finest of English summer mornings. I had risen early, drawn by the prospect of exploring the estate's renowned gardens, before the heat of the day made such pursuits less agreeable. From my chamber window, the view across the carefully manicured lawns to the distant copse presented a scene of such pastoral beauty that one might easily forget the complexities and anxieties that mark modern existence. Poirot, I discovered upon descending to the breakfast-room, had already completed his morning ablutions with that meticulous care which characterized all his personal habits. He sat at the mahogany table with his customary precision, consuming a modest breakfast while perusing correspondence that had arrived with the morning post. "Ah, Hastings," he remarked upon my entrance, "you observe the perfection of this domestic arrangement. Everything it speaks to careful planning and attention to the smallest detail, most instructive for one who studies the human character." Indeed, the household arrangements reflected Lady Mallory's considerable skills as a hostess. The servants moved with quiet efficiency, the table appointments were flawless, and the morning's menu provided both substance and variety without ostentation. Yet I detected beneath this smooth surface certain undercurrents of nervous energy that suggested the approaching wedding was creating strains not immediately apparent to the casual observer. Helena herself appeared shortly before 9 o'clock, her manner betraying a restlessness that seemed at odds with the serene domestic atmosphere. She wore a morning dress of pale yellow muslin that complemented her dark coloring admirably, yet her movements possessed an almost feverish quality as she moved between the breakfast sideboard and the French doors opening onto the terrace. "I trust you gentlemen slept well?" she inquired, though her attention seemed divided between our responses and some private preoccupation that commanded the greater portion of her thoughts. "Most excellently, thank you," I replied. "The country air, after the stuffiness of London, proves remarkably restorative. I was just commenting to Poirot upon the exceptional beauty of your gardens in this season." "Yes, father has always taken particular pride in the grounds," Helena responded, though her gaze drifted repeatedly toward the drive visible through the morning-room windows. "He considers the landscape an extension of the house itself, each element carefully positioned to create the desired impression." The morning's tranquility was shattered shortly before 11 o'clock by the unexpected arrival of a motor car whose occupant proved to be entirely unknown to the assembled company. Through the morning-room windows, I observed a portly gentleman of middle years extracting himself from what appeared to be a hired conveyance with considerable difficulty. His appearance was respectable without being distinguished, the sort of commercial traveller or minor professional one might encounter in any provincial town. Helena's reaction to this arrival was immediate and profound. The colour drained from her complexion, and her hands, I observed, trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. But it was Gerald Fenton's response that proved most telling, his usual jovial expression replaced by something approaching alarm as he recognized the visitor through the window. "Good Lord!" Gerald muttered under his breath. "What the devil is Bristow doing here?" "You know this gentleman?" Richard inquired, noting his friend's obvious discomfort. "Arthur Bristow," Gerald replied reluctantly. "A business acquaintance from my South American ventures, rather persistent in his commercial relationships." Helena rose abruptly from the table. "Excuse me," she murmured. "I believe I should greet our visitor." Through the open French doors we could hear voices from the front terrace. Helena's cultured tones interspersed with a rougher accent that carried clearly across the morning air. "Miss Mallory, you're looking remarkably well," the stranger was saying as we approached the terrace. "Marriage evidently agrees with you even before the ceremony, though I must confess surprise at not receiving an invitation to this grand affair." "Mr. Bristow?" Helena's voice carried a note of barely controlled tension. "I cannot imagine what brings you to Hampshire, but surely you must realize that your presence here is neither expected nor particularly welcome." The man she addressed as Bristow possessed that particular assurance which marks certain types of successful businessmen, the sort who have learned to interpret social situations primarily in terms of advantage and opportunity. His clothing was well made, but somehow inappropriate to the setting, his manner suggesting familiarity with Helena that extended far beyond casual acquaintance. "Come now, my dear," he continued, his tone carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been threat or merely crude familiarity. "Surely old business associates deserve some consideration, particularly when they've taken the trouble to travel such a distance. Besides, I understand young Thornton and I may have certain mutual interests in the import trade." Richard Thornton himself appeared at that moment, having evidently been summoned by the commotion. His reaction to Bristow's presence was carefully controlled, though his legal training enabled him to recognize potential complications that extended beyond mere social awkwardness. "I'm afraid there has been some misunderstanding," he said, his barrister's training evident in the careful modulation of his voice. "This is a private family celebration, and I cannot recall extending any invitation to—" "Arthur Bristow," the intruder supplied with apparent satisfaction. "And you're quite right, young man. No formal invitation was extended. However, when one learns of the wedding plans of former business associates, particularly those involving partnerships in South American ventures, one feels obligated to offer congratulations in person." The conversation that followed proved both illuminating and disturbing. Bristow's references to previous arrangements and his pointed comments about maintaining discretion in commercial matters created an atmosphere of tension that seemed to encompass the entire gathering. Helena's responses became increasingly sharp, while Gerald Fenton appeared to struggle with some internal conflict that manifested itself in nervous glances between Bristow and the other wedding guests. "I think it would be best if you departed immediately," Helena finally declared, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no contradiction. "Your presence here serves no useful purpose, and I must ask you to respect my family's privacy during this important occasion." Bristow's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Oh, I think I will remain for the festivities, my dear. After all, weddings are such joyous occasions, and I have particular reasons for wishing to witness this union. Besides, I find myself quite curious about certain aspects of Mr. Thornton's legal practice. We may have more to discuss than any of you imagine." The threat implicit in his words was unmistakable, though its precise nature remained unclear. Other wedding guests had begun to gather on the terrace, drawn by the evident drama unfolding before them. Richard's protective stance near Helena spoke eloquently of his concern, while Gerald's obvious distress suggested knowledge of circumstances that extended beyond the immediate confrontation. As Bristow was eventually shown to a guest chamber, Lady Mallory's breeding preventing any direct refusal of hospitality, however unwelcome, I found myself reflecting upon the sudden transformation that had overtaken our peaceful social gathering. The man's arrival had introduced elements of uncertainty and potential scandal that threatened to overshadow the approaching celebration entirely. Poirot, I observed, had witnessed these proceedings with that particular intensity he reserved for situations of genuine interest. As we retired to our chambers before luncheon, his only comment was characteristically cryptic. "Most instructive, mon ami. The past, it has a way of intruding upon the present, often at the most inconvenient moments. And this Mr. Bristow, he carries with him the smell of secrets that others would prefer to keep buried." The remainder of the day passed in an atmosphere of forced normalcy, though the undercurrents of tension created by Bristow's presence were evident to anyone possessed of even moderate powers of observation. Chapter 4. The Wedding Day. Chapter 4. The Wedding Day. The morning of the wedding dawned with that peculiar mixture of promise and uncertainty which seemed to characterize our entire sojourn at Wisteria House. The weather mercifully had cleared from the previous evening's brief shower, presenting a sky of such crystalline perfection that one might have ordered it specifically for the occasion. Yet beneath this meteorological blessing lay currents of tension that no amount of sunshine could entirely dispel. As was customary for such celebrations, the male guests had been invited to participate in a traditional hunt across the estate's extensive grounds. Having maintained my interest in equestrian pursuits despite advancing years, I found myself looking forward to this morning's diversion with genuine anticipation. The prospect of exploring the Hampshire countryside on horseback, particularly in such distinguished company, struck me as an admirable prelude to the wedding ceremony itself. Poirot predictably declined to participate in these proceedings. "The pursuit of innocent creatures for sport, mon ami, it does not appeal to the Belgian temperament," he explained, with that slight smile which often accompanied his more philosophical observations. "Besides, I find the domestic preparations for such an occasion far more revealing of human character than any display of horsemanship." The hunting party assembled shortly after 8 o'clock, comprising perhaps a dozen gentlemen of varying degrees of enthusiasm and expertise. Richard Thornton, though clearly preoccupied with the approaching ceremony, demonstrated admirable courtesy in his role as host, ensuring that mounts were properly assigned and that the less experienced riders received appropriate guidance. His manner throughout these preparations struck me as that of a man determined to fulfill social obligations despite considerable personal distraction. Gerald Fenton proved himself an accomplished horseman, his jovial nature extending to helpful suggestions about the estate's terrain and the likely behavior of the local foxes. "Splendid country for a hunt," he remarked as we gathered in the stable yard. "Sir James has maintained the traditional boundaries with admirable care, and the coverts provide excellent sport." Arthur Bristow's inclusion in the party created an undercurrent of awkwardness that no amount of sporting camaraderie could entirely overcome. His horsemanship was adequate rather than elegant, and his riding costume, while serviceable, lacked the understated quality that marked the attire of gentlemen born to such pursuits. More significantly, his attempts at conversation were met with polite, but distinctly cool responses from the other participants. "Fine morning for outdoor exercise," he observed, to no one in particular as we prepared to move off. "Nothing like a good gallop to stimulate the appetite for celebration." The hunt itself proceeded with reasonable success, though I noticed Gerald Fenton's particular attention to his mount's care, especially regarding the condition of his riding boots, which he examined with unusual interest before mounting. The morning proved more strenuous than anticipated, with several challenging jumps and a particularly muddy stretch through the lower meadows that tested both horsemanship and equipment. By 10 o'clock, threatening clouds had begun to gather with the suddenness characteristic of June weather. What started as a light mist quickly developed into a steady drizzle, then progressed to a genuine downpour that transformed the carefully groomed paths into increasingly treacherous footing for both horses and riders. "We'd best return to the house," Richard announced as the precipitation intensified. "The last thing we need is for anyone to suffer injury on my wedding day." The retreat to Wisteria House proved none too soon, as the heavens opened with that sudden violence characteristic of summer thunderstorms. Our party arrived in the stable yard thoroughly soaked, our boots caked with mud, and our previous morning's grooming entirely undone. The contrast between our bedraggled appearance and the immaculate preparations visible throughout the house created a scene of almost comical incongruity. "Gentlemen, I suggest immediate attention to your toilet," Sir James advised with the practical wisdom of one long accustomed to country life. "The ceremony commences in precisely 1 hour, and I suspect our current appearance would not enhance the dignity of the occasion." The subsequent rush to chambers, baths, and fresh attire created a flurry of domestic activity that temporarily obscured the underlying tensions of Bristow's presence. Servants scurried between rooms with hot water, clean linens, and hastily pressed garments, while the gentlemen themselves navigated the delicate business of transforming muddy horsemen into wedding guests within the space of 60 minutes. My own preparations proceeded smoothly enough, though I confess to some concern about the state of my morning dress after its exposure to the elements. Poirot, discovered in our sitting-room, perusing a volume of local history, observed my disheveled condition with evident amusement. "The English passion for outdoor sport, she creates most interesting contrasts," he remarked. "One moment the country gentleman in pursuit of the fox, the next the polished society guest prepared for sacred ceremony. Most illuminating in terms of social adaptability. The wedding ceremony itself proceeded with a beauty and solemnity that temporarily banished all thoughts of morning difficulties or unwelcome guests. Helena, radiant in silk and ancestral lace, moved through the service with a grace that commanded universal admiration. The local church, decorated with flowers from the estate's gardens, provided a setting of such perfect traditional elegance that one might have commissioned it specifically for artistic effect. Richard's responses throughout the ceremony were clear and confident, though I detected in his manners that slight tension which marks even the most willing bridegroom during such momentous occasions. The vicar, a gentleman of advanced years who had evidently known the Mallory family for decades, conducted the service with a dignity that befitted both the participants and the historic significance of the moment. Even Bristow, positioned somewhat awkwardly among the congregation, maintained appropriate decorum throughout the proceedings. His presence, while still unwelcome, seemed temporarily neutralized by the sacred nature of the occasion and the weight of traditional expectation that surrounds such ceremonies. The transition from church to reception created opportunities for the sort of informal conversation that often proves most revealing of social dynamics. As guests moved between the drawing rooms and out onto the terrace, I observed the careful choreography that marks successful entertaining among the English gentry. Lady Mallory's arrangements were flawless, from the positioning of refreshment tables to the subtle guidance that ensured proper circulation among diverse social groups. The early afternoon's festivities gained momentum as champagne and wedding cake created that atmosphere of elevated spirits which marks the finest celebrations. Dancing commenced in the main drawing room, while smaller groups gathered on the terrace to enjoy the clearing weather and the spectacular views across the estate's gardens. Helena and Richard moved among their guests with evident happiness, their earlier tensions apparently dissolved in the pleasure of the moment. Yet throughout these proceedings I maintained awareness of certain undercurrents that suggested all was not entirely harmonious beneath the surface gaiety. Bristow's attempts to engage various guests in conversation met with varying degrees of success, while his particular attention to business matters seemed to create discomfort among those he approached. Gerald Fenton, in particular, appeared to maintain careful distance from the unwelcome guest, though his natural courtesy prevented any obvious slight. As the celebration reached its peak of animation, and the newly wedded couple prepared to cut the ceremonial cake, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable events that had transformed this simple social gathering into something far more complex and mysterious than anyone could have anticipated. Chapter 5. Death in the Library. The transformation of celebration into tragedy occurred with that suddenness which characterizes the most profound disruptions of human existence. One moment we were engaged in the pleasant rituals of wedding festivity, the gentle murmur of conversation, the tinkling of crystal, the subdued laughter that accompanies such refined gatherings. And the next, our world had been forever altered by the discovery that was to cast its shadow over all subsequent events. The afternoon had progressed with admirable smoothness following the morning's meteorological interruptions. The reception had achieved that perfect balance of formality and warmth which marks the most successful social occasions, with guests circulating freely between the various reception rooms and the terrace overlooking the gardens. Helena and Richard moved among the company with evident pleasure, their happiness providing a focal point around which the entire celebration seemed to revolve. It was during the cutting of the wedding cake, at approximately 3 o'clock, that Arthur Bristow's absence from the festivities first became noticeable. Lady Mallory, with that attention to detail which marked her as an experienced hostess, observed his disappearance from the company with growing concern. "Captain Hastings," she approached me discreetly as the cake ceremony concluded, "I wonder if I might impose upon your good nature for a small service. It appears that Mr. Bristow has withdrawn from the celebration, and I'm rather concerned about his whereabouts. Would you be so kind as to make a discreet inquiry? I should hate for any guest to feel overlooked during such an important occasion." Her request, though phrased with characteristic diplomatic delicacy, carried undertones that suggested she shared the general relief at Bristow's absence from the immediate festivities. Nevertheless, the obligations of hospitality demanded that some attention be paid to his welfare, however unwelcome his presence might have proven. "Of course, Lady Mallory," I replied. "I shall be delighted to assist." My search for the missing guest began in the obvious locations, the smoking room, the billiard room, and the various smaller reception areas where a gentleman might retreat for solitude or reflection. Finding no trace of him in these obvious refuges, I expanded my inquiries to include the morning room and finally the library, that magnificent room lined with leather-bound volumes that served as Sir James's private sanctuary when not entertaining guests. It was here, in this temple to literature and learning, that I made the discovery which was to transform our pleasant social gathering into something far more sinister and complex. The scene that presented itself as I opened the heavy oak door remains etched in my memory with that particular clarity reserved for moments of profound shock. Arthur Bristow, sat slumped in one of the leather reading chairs positioned near the large mullioned windows that provided natural illumination for scholarly pursuits. His position was that of a man who had simply dozed off while reading, not uncommon in such comfortable surroundings, yet something in the absolute stillness of his form immediately suggested a more permanent condition. My initial approach was cautious, prompted by that instinctive reluctance to disturb what might be merely peaceful sleep. However, as I drew closer, the true nature of the situation became horrifyingly apparent. A dark stain had spread across the right side of Bristow's head, while his clothing bore unmistakable evidence of violence that no amount of charitable interpretation could explain away. On the floor beside the chair lay a service revolver, a Webley of the type with which my military service had made me familiar. Near Bristow's left hand, a sheet of paper bore what appeared to be writing in his characteristic cramped script, though my initial shock prevented immediate examination of its contents. The discovery that followed my urgent summons brought the household's carefully orchestrated celebration to an abrupt and shocking conclusion. Sir James arrived first, his face growing grave as he absorbed the implications of the scene before us. Lady Mallory's composure, though tested by the circumstances, remained admirably intact as she efficiently organized the practical requirements of such an emergency. "We must summon the police immediately," Sir James declared, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to crisis management. "And I'm afraid the celebration must be suspended until this matter can be properly investigated." The local constabulary arrived with commendable promptness, led by Inspector Meadows, a stolid gentleman whose experience with rural crime had evidently not prepared him for such dramatic circumstances. His initial examination of the scene proceeded methodically, though I detected in his manner that satisfaction which marks officials confronted with apparently straightforward conclusions. "Suicide, I should say," he announced after completing his preliminary investigation. "The weapon, the positioning, and this note all point to a clear case of self-destruction. Most unfortunate timing, of course, but these commercial types often carry burdens that aren't immediately apparent to casual observers." The note itself, when examined, appeared to support the inspector's assessment. Written in Bristow's hand, it contained references to unbearable financial pressures and impossible obligations that suggested a man driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond his control. The language was that of genuine despair, though something in its phrasing struck me as slightly theatrical, too carefully composed perhaps for a man in the extremity of self-destruction. Helena's reaction to these developments was immediate, profound. The news of Bristow's death seemed to affect her more deeply than mere shock at unexpected tragedy might account for, while her responses to the inspector's routine questions betrayed a nervousness that extended beyond normal social awkwardness in such circumstances. "Mrs. Thornton," Inspector Meadows addressed her with the careful courtesy demanded by her social position, "I understand you had some previous acquaintance with the deceased. Might I inquire about the nature of your relationship?" Helena's hesitation before responding was brief but noticeable. "Mr. Bristow was a business acquaintance of my family. I had not seen him for several years before his unexpected arrival yesterday." "And your conversation with him yesterday morning, several witnesses observed what appeared to be a rather heated exchange. Might you enlighten me as to the substance of that discussion?" The color that rose in Helena's cheeks was clearly visible to all present. He had certain misconceptions about old family business matters. I merely attempted to clarify that such concerns were no longer relevant. Inspector Meadows made careful notes of these responses, though his manner suggested growing interest rather than satisfied acceptance. The timing of Bristow's death, occurring as it did during the wedding reception, and so soon after the public disagreement, created implications that even the most charitable interpretation could not entirely dismiss. Richard Thornton's support of his new wife was immediate and unqualified, though I detected in his legal training a recognition of the potential complications these circumstances might create. His responses to the inspector's questions were precise and helpful, yet carried that careful quality which marks those who understand the importance of exact language in official proceedings. Poirot, who had observed these developments with his characteristic attention to detail, approached me as the inspector concluded his initial investigation. His manner suggested thoughts that extended far beyond the obvious conclusions being drawn by the official inquiry. "Most interesting, mon ami," he murmured, his keen eyes surveying the library with methodical precision. "The scene tells a story, but perhaps not the story that appears so obvious to our good inspector." As the wedding guests departed in subdued confusion, and the household settled into the grim business of dealing with unexpected death, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable transformation that had occurred within the space of a few short hours. What had begun as a celebration of love and new beginnings had become something far darker and more complex, a puzzle that would test even Poirot's legendary powers of deduction before its final resolution could be achieved. Chapter 6. Under Suspicion. The curious circumstances surrounding Arthur Bristow's death had begun to weave themselves into a web of suspicion that threatened to entangle all who had witnessed the previous day's unfortunate events. As a retired military officer with ample experience of human nature under stress, I found myself uniquely positioned to observe the subtle transformations that occur when ordinary social gatherings become the subject of criminal investigation. The morning following the tragedy dawned grey and oppressive, as though the very atmosphere of Wisteria House had absorbed something of the shadow cast by Bristow's demise. Inspector Meadows had established his temporary headquarters in Sir James's study, transforming that sanctuary of literary pursuits into an examination room where each member of the household and wedding party would face the methodical scrutiny of official inquiry. Helena bore the weight of this attention with a composure that spoke well of her breeding, yet I detected beneath her carefully maintained exterior the strain of one whose every word and gesture had acquired potential significance in the eyes of the law. Her position as the deceased's most obvious antagonist created a burden of suspicion that no amount of social standing could entirely alleviate. "Mrs. Thornton," Inspector Meadows addressed her during what I understood to be their second formal interview, "I must ask you to reconsider your previous statements regarding your relationship with the deceased. Our investigations have revealed that Mr. Bristow possessed detailed knowledge of certain family financial arrangements that suggests a more substantial acquaintance than you initially described." Helena's response, though carefully controlled, betrayed the emotional cost of these repeated interrogations. "Inspector, I have been entirely truthful in my statements. Mr. Bristow was involved in certain business dealings with my late uncle's estate several years ago. His invocations of continuing relevance to our family affairs were entirely without foundation." This revelation of a family connection through her deceased uncle provided the first substantial clue to the true nature of Helena's relationship with Bristow. Her uncle, as I learned through discreet inquiries, had been involved in South American trade before his untimely death in Buenos Aires 3 years earlier, leaving behind certain unresolved business complications. Yet even as she spoke these words with admirable conviction, I observed the slight tremor in her hands that suggested depths of anxiety not immediately apparent to casual observation. My own military experience had taught me to recognize the signs of nervous strain, and Helena's behavior exhibited all the characteristics of one laboring under pressures that extended beyond mere grief at unexpected death. Richard Thornton's support of his bride remained unwavering, though his legal training had clearly identified the potential gravity of their situation. During his own interview with the inspector, he displayed that careful precision of language which marks the accomplished barrister. Yet I detected undertones of concern that suggested recognition of circumstances beyond his professional control. My wife's distress at Mr. Bristow's intrusion was entirely understandable, he stated with measured emphasis. The man's behavior was presumptuous and inappropriate for such an occasion. However, to suggest that this justifies suspicion of involvement in his death strikes me as a most alarming leap of logic. Inspector Meadows, however, appeared unconvinced by these protestations of innocence. His investigation had begun to focus with increasing intensity upon the timing of events, the opportunity for private conversation with the deceased, and the apparent contradiction between Helena's claimed limited knowledge of Bristow's affairs and the intimacy suggested by their public confrontation. The facts, as I understand them, the inspector explained to Sir James during a conversation I was privileged to overhear, point to a young woman with both motive and opportunity. The deceased clearly possessed information about her family's business dealings that caused her considerable distress, and his death occurred at a moment when she could have acted without immediate detection. This official line of reasoning created an atmosphere of mounting tension throughout the household that no amount of careful courtesy could entirely conceal. The servants moved about their duties with that particular consciousness of crisis which marks domestic establishments under external scrutiny, while the remaining wedding guests found themselves trapped between social obligation and personal unease at their unexpected involvement in criminal proceedings. Poirot's response to these developments differed markedly from the inspector's methodical but conventional approach. Rather than focusing primarily upon the obvious suspect, my friend had begun that characteristic process of detailed observation and seemingly casual inquiry which preceded his most brilliant deductive achievements. I discovered him on the morning of the second day, examining the library with that meticulous attention to detail which marked his investigative method. His interest appeared to center not upon the chair where Bristow's body had been discovered, but rather upon the carpet and furnishings in the immediate vicinity, particularly near the windows where the morning light provided optimal illumination. "You observe something significant, Poirot?" I inquired, noting his particular attention to a section of polished floor near the reading table. "Perhaps, mon ami. The eye, it sees many things, but the trained mind, it must distinguish between the significant and the merely coincidental. Tell me, Hastings, what impressions did you form of the hunting party's return yesterday morning?" This seemingly tangential inquiry struck me as typical of Poirot's approach to complex problems. The usual mixture of enthusiasm and incompetence that marks such gatherings. The weather proved unfortunate, naturally, and we returned considerably the worse for wear. "Ah, yes, the weather, most inconvenient for outdoor pursuits, but perhaps illuminating in other respects. You recall the condition of the participants upon your return? Thoroughly soaked and muddy, I'm afraid. The stable yard resembled a battlefield after our retreat from the elements. We all required immediate attention to our dress and personal grooming." Poirot nodded with evident satisfaction. "Précisément. And the boots, Hastings, you observed the condition of the footwear following this morning's adventure?" His question seemed to possess significance that extended beyond mere curiosity about hunting attire, though I confess myself unable to penetrate his reasoning. Much as one would expect after traversing muddy terrain in a downpour. Nothing remarkable in that, surely? Perhaps not remarkable, but potentially most instructive. The details, mon ami, always it is the details that illuminate the truth. Throughout this period of official investigation and private inquiry, I maintained careful observation of the various personalities involved in our increasingly complex situation. Gerald Fenton, the bridegroom's best man, displayed that particular combination of helpful cooperation and underlying nervousness which often marks those caught between loyalty to friends and respect for legal authority. His responses to Inspector Meadows's questions were forthright and apparently complete, yet I detected occasional hesitations that suggested thoughts he chose not to express. "Bristow struck me as a rather unpleasant fellow," he admitted during one conversation. "The sort who enjoys creating discomfort for others through implications of knowledge he may or may not actually possess. Not the type one would ordinarily welcome at such a celebration." His assessment of the deceased aligned with my own observations, yet something in his manner suggested reservations about aspects of the situation that he deemed inappropriate for public discussion. The complex dynamics of loyalty and suspicion that mark any group subjected to criminal investigation had begun to manifest themselves among our small company with increasing clarity. As the investigation proceeded and Inspector Meadows's suspicions regarding Helena's involvement became increasingly apparent, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable transformation that had occurred within our small social circle. What had begun as a celebration of new beginnings had evolved into a test of character and loyalty that would leave permanent marks upon all involved, regardless of the ultimate resolution of Bristow's mysterious demise. Chapter 7. The Little Grey Cells at Work. The curious developments at Wisteria House had begun to assume that particular character which marks the most perplexing criminal investigations, a quality wherein obvious conclusions prove increasingly unsatisfactory under careful scrutiny, while seemingly insignificant details acquire unexpected importance. As a former military officer with considerable experience of human nature under extreme circumstances, I found myself drawn into the intricate web of suspicion and counter-suspicion that now enveloped our formerly pleasant social gathering. Poirot's approach to the mounting crisis differed markedly from Inspector Meadows's methodical but conventional investigation. Where the official inquiry focused upon motive and opportunity in their most obvious manifestations, my friend had begun that characteristic process of detailed observation and psychological analysis which preceded his most remarkable deductive achievements. His behavior during the third morning following Bristow's death suggested thoughts that extended far beyond the apparent simplicity of suicide, or the inspector's growing conviction regarding Helena's guilt. I discovered him in the library shortly after breakfast, examining the scene of the tragedy with that meticulous attention to minute details which marked his investigative method. His interest appeared to focus upon aspects of the room that had escaped official notice, the precise positioning of furniture, the arrangement of books upon nearby shelves, and most particularly the condition of the polished floor in the immediate vicinity of where Bristow's body had been discovered. "Hastings, mon ami," he said, without looking up from his examination of the carpet near the windows. "Approach, if you please, and tell me what observations you make regarding this particular area." I complied with his request, though I confess myself unable initially to perceive anything remarkable about the section of flooring that commanded his attention. The library's Persian carpet of excellent quality and considerable age showed the inevitable signs of regular use, while the polished wood visible at its borders reflected the careful maintenance characteristic of well-managed households. "I'm afraid I see nothing particularly significant, Poirot. The usual wear patterns one might expect in a gentleman's library, nothing more. But regard more carefully, I beg you. Here, near the leg of this reading table, you observe a certain discoloration, very faint but present nonetheless." Following his guidance, I detected what appeared to be a slight darkening of the wood, roughly circular in shape and perhaps 2 inches in diameter. The mark was indeed barely perceptible, the sort of minor blemish that might easily escape casual observation, yet prove significant to trained eyes. Yes, I see it now. Some sort of stain, I suppose. Water damage, perhaps, or not water, mon ami. You observe the pattern, the distinct outline. This marking, it tells Poirot much about the events that occurred here. His eyes, those remarkable green orbs that seemed to penetrate every mystery, held that particular gleam which indicated thoughts of considerable complexity. Tell me, Hastings, during your examination of the deceased's papers yesterday, what did you observe regarding his handwriting? This apparent digression struck me as characteristic of Poirot's method, though I struggled to perceive the connection between Bristow's penmanship and the library's flooring. His script was rather cramped and distinctive, as I mentioned. The suicide note bore the characteristics of his usual style, though Inspector Meadows had it examined by an expert to confirm authenticity. Ah, yes, the expert examination. And what conclusion did this specialist reach? That the note was indeed written by Bristow himself, though the expert noted certain peculiarities in the formation of letters that suggested the writer might have been under considerable emotional strain. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Or perhaps copying from another example of his own handwriting, no? Tell me, mon ami, what did our departed guest carry with him in terms of correspondence or personal papers? I reflected upon the inventory of Bristow's possessions that Inspector Meadows had compiled. Several business letters, a leather portfolio containing various commercial documents, and what appeared to be a sample contract for import arrangements, the sort of paperwork one might expect from a man involved in international trade. Most interesting. And this contract, it bore his signature, naturally? Indeed, several signatures actually, as such documents often require multiple authorizations and amendments. I paused, beginning to perceive the direction of Poirot's thinking. You suggest that someone might have used these signatures as models for forging the suicide note? The possibility exists, mon ami, but let us return to this mark upon the floor. Consider, if you please, the nature of this stain. The shape, it is distinctive, circular, with slightly irregular edges. Combined with the circumstances of the morning hunt, what conclusions might one draw? I examined the mark more carefully, applying such knowledge as my years of service had provided regarding the various substances that might create such impressions. It appears to be the sort of mark that might be left by the sole of a boot, I suppose, a wet boot, pressed firmly against the wood and left there for some time. Précisément, the boot print left by one whose footwear retained considerable moisture. And now, mon ami, consider the significance of this discovery. The library floors were cleaned and polished by the efficient staff before the wedding ceremony commenced. This mark was made after those preparations were complete. The implications of his observation began to dawn upon me with growing clarity. You mean to suggest that someone wearing wet boots from the hunt visited this room after the floors had been cleaned, but before they had opportunity to dry their footwear properly? Not merely visited Hastings, but stood precisely here, near the chair where poor Bristow was subsequently discovered. The positioning is most instructive. Someone remained stationary at this spot for sufficient time to leave such a distinct impression. As Poirot's reasoning became clearer, I found myself reconsidering the entire sequence of events that had led to Bristow's death. The official theory of suicide, already strained by certain inconsistencies in timing and behavior, became increasingly difficult to maintain in light of this new evidence. But surely, I protested, the presence of wet boot prints merely indicates that someone sought shelter in the library during the storm. Nothing necessarily sinister in that. Ah, mon ami, but you forget the crucial detail of timing. The hunt returned at approximately 10:30 in the morning. The wedding ceremony commenced at 11:30. The reception began at 1 o'clock, and the body was discovered at 3:15. For a boot print to remain sufficiently moist to create such a mark, the wearer would need to have visited this room within perhaps 30 minutes of returning from the hunt. The significance of this deduction struck me with considerable force. If Poirot's reasoning proved correct, then someone who had participated in the hunt had entered the library with still wet boots at a time when they should have been attending to their grooming for the wedding ceremony. Furthermore, Poirot continued, his voice taking on that particular quality which marked his most important revelations, consider the nature of the hunting party itself, who participated, and more significantly, who possessed both the knowledge and the means necessary to arrange poor Bristow's apparent suicide. I found myself reviewing the membership of that morning's expedition with new attention to detail. The participants had included Richard, Gerald, several local gentlemen, Bristow himself, and various others whose specific movements during the crucial period would need to be carefully examined. The positioning of this boot print suggests someone who stood here for several minutes, Poirot observed, indicating the precise location where the mark appeared. Not merely passing through but remaining stationary, perhaps engaged in some deliberate activity that required careful attention to detail. As these revelations accumulated, I began to perceive the outline of a far more complex and sinister scenario than either the suicide theory or Inspector Meadows' suspicions regarding Helena had suggested. The careful attention to timing, the knowledge of household routines, and the deliberate nature of the evidence all pointed toward premeditation of a most sophisticated nature. The implications of Poirot's discoveries extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Bristow's death, suggesting depths of intrigue and carefully concealed relationships that transformed our understanding of the entire situation. As I reflected upon the various personalities we had encountered during our stay at Wisteria House, I found myself reconsidering each individual's behavior and statements in light of these disturbing new possibilities. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The culmination of our extraordinary sojourn at Wisteria House arrived with that sense of inevitable conclusion which marks the resolution of the most perplexing human dramas. As a retired military officer with considerable experience of crisis and revelation, I had witnessed many moments when hidden truths emerge to transform our understanding of events, yet few occasions had prepared me for the masterful demonstration of deductive reasoning that Poirot was about to provide for our assembled company. The gathering in the library on that final evening possessed all the theatrical elements that my friend so dearly appreciated. Inspector Meadows, though somewhat reluctant to indulge what he clearly considered continental eccentricity, had agreed to Poirot's request that all parties to our mystery should assemble in the very room where Arthur Bristow had met his unfortunate end. The symbolism was not lost upon any of us, and I detected in the various countenances that mixture of apprehension and curiosity which marks those who suspect they are about to witness something of considerable significance. Helena and Richard occupied chairs near the fireplace, their newly wedded state lending them a natural unity against the suspicions that had clouded their brief married life. Sir James and Lady Mallory maintained their characteristic dignity despite the strain of recent events, while Gerald Fenton positioned himself somewhat apart from the others, his usual jovial manner replaced by something approaching wariness. Inspector Meadows had arranged himself at the desk, notebook at hand, prepared to record whatever revelations might emerge from these unusual proceedings. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular authority which had commanded attention in drawing-rooms across Europe, we gather tonight to examine a tragedy that has transformed celebration into mourning, joy into suspicion, and apparent simplicity into complex deception. His opening words established the gravity of the occasion while maintaining that dramatic flair which so characterized his approach to revelation. I observed the faces before us with careful attention, noting the subtle variations in expression that marked each individual's particular relationship to the unfolding drama. The death of Arthur Bristow, Poirot continued, presented itself initially as suicide, a conclusion supported by physical evidence and apparently confirmed by the deceased's own written confession. Yet from the beginning certain elements troubled the logical mind: the positioning of the weapon, the nature of the farewell note, and most significantly, the psychology of the victim himself suggested a different interpretation of events. Inspector Meadows shifted somewhat impatiently in his chair. "Monsieur Poirot, while I appreciate your analytical approach, the physical evidence clearly points to Mrs. Thornton, motivated by her family's past business entanglements with the deceased." "Ah, but there you make the fundamental error, mon ami. You observe the surface manifestations without penetrating to the deeper truths that explain them. The connection between Mrs. Thornton and the unfortunate Bristow was indeed significant, but not in the manner you suppose." Helena's color heightened at these words, though whether from relief or continued anxiety remained unclear. Richard's protective gesture toward his wife spoke eloquently of his unwavering support despite the mounting pressures of official suspicion. "The key to understanding this tragedy," Poirot explained with growing intensity, "lies not in old family business matters, but in current commercial arrangements that threaten to destroy both reputation and freedom. Arthur Bristow possessed evidence of systematic embezzlement from a thriving import business with extensive South American connections." He paused dramatically, his keen eyes surveying the assembled faces with that penetrating intensity which seemed to read the very thoughts of those before him. Bristow had discovered that his business partner was systematically diverting funds from their joint ventures, using his position to cover substantial gambling debts that threatened financial ruin. Gerald Fenton's reaction to these words was immediate and profound. The color drained from his face, while his hands, I observed, trembled slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair. The transformation from genial wedding guest to cornered criminal was remarkable in its completeness. "The morning hunt," Poirot continued relentlessly, "provided the perfect opportunity for private conversation between blackmailer and victim. During the return journey, as the parties struggled with deteriorating weather conditions, Mr. Fenton arranged to meet Bristow privately in the library immediately following the wedding ceremony." "This is preposterous," Gerald protested, though his voice lacked the conviction necessary to carry persuasion. "I barely knew Bristow beyond casual business acquaintance." "On the contrary, mon ami, your acquaintance was both intimate and profitable until Bristow's investigations threatened to expose your systematic theft from the import business you operated jointly with other partners. The funds diverted to cover your gambling obligations were substantial, and discovery would have meant not merely financial ruin, but criminal prosecution. The revelation of Gerald's financial desperation transformed our understanding of the entire situation. What had appeared to be random coincidence now revealed itself as careful planning, while the apparent spontaneity of the crime dissolved under scrutiny of its methodical execution. "The murder itself was carefully planned," Poirot explained, his voice taking on that particular quality which marked his most impressive deductions. "During the hunt's early return, Mr. Fenton deliberately preserved the moisture in his riding boots by concealing them in the stable tack-room rather than allowing them to dry properly. After quickly changing his outer garments for the ceremony, he retained these damp boots for his planned meeting with Bristow. The physical evidence that had so puzzled our initial investigation now assumed its proper significance. The wet boot print that Poirot had discovered near Bristow's chair provided irrefutable proof of the murderer's presence at the crucial moment, while the timing eliminated all other members of the hunting party who had properly attended to their grooming. "The suicide note," Poirot continued inexorably, "was prepared using samples of Bristow's handwriting found among the commercial correspondence he carried. The killer had ample opportunity to study these documents during their business relationship, enabling him to create a convincing forgery when the need arose. The shooting itself was accomplished with cold calculation, he explained further. The weapon, Mr. Fenton's service revolver from the war, was positioned to suggest self-destruction, while the prepared note was placed beside the body. The timing, during the height of wedding festivities, ensured that the crime would not be discovered until the murderer had ample opportunity to establish his alibi among the celebrating guests. Gerald's composure finally collapsed under this methodical exposition of his guilt. The jovial best man, the loyal friend, the popular guest, all revealed themselves as elaborate masks concealing the calculating mind of a desperate criminal. His confession, when it came, possessed that quality of relief which marks those who can no longer sustain the burden of deception. Helena's quarrel with Bristow, Poirot concluded, concerned her late uncle's estate, in which Bristow had discovered certain irregularities years earlier. Her distress stemmed from fear that these old scandals might emerge to taint her wedding day, not from any involvement in current crimes. Inspector Meadows, his notebook recording every detail of this extraordinary revelation, gradually assumed control of the situation with the efficient authority of official duty. The transformation of social gathering into criminal proceeding proceeded with that inexorable quality which marks the triumph of justice over deception. As the evening concluded and Gerald Fenton was led away to face the consequences of his actions, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable demonstration of analytical genius I had witnessed. Poirot's ability to penetrate beyond obvious appearances to hidden truths had once again vindicated his confidence in the power of pure reason to illuminate even the most carefully concealed mysteries. The shadow that had threatened to destroy Helena and Richard's future happiness had been lifted through the application of those little grey cells which my friend so frequently invoked as his primary investigative weapon. Epilogue. The train to London carried us away from Hampshire 3 days after Gerald Fenton's arrest, the countryside passing in a gentle blur of green fields and cottage gardens that seemed to mock the dark events we had witnessed. I found myself reflecting as the wheels clicked rhythmically along the tracks upon the extraordinary transformation that had occurred at what should have been a celebration of love and new beginnings. Poirot sat opposite me in our compartment, immaculate as always despite our recent trials, his green eyes contemplating the landscape with that peculiar intensity he brought to all observations. The events at Wisteria House had affected him more than he cared to admit, for beneath his vanity and theatrical manner lay a genuine compassion for human suffering that made such revelations of betrayal particularly painful. "It is curious, mon ami," he remarked, breaking the comfortable silence between us, "how the seeds of tragedy are so often sown by the very qualities we most admire in human nature: loyalty, friendship, the desire to protect those we care about. In Gerald Fenton, these virtues became the instruments of his destruction." I nodded, understanding his meaning. Gerald's fondness for gambling had been present since his Oxford days, a harmless indulgence at first. But when coupled with his access to business funds and his determination to remain Richard's trusted friend, it had created a spiral of deception that could only end in disaster. Even the detail of his deliberately kept wet boots, so small yet so damning, spoke of a man who thought he could outwit both circumstance and conscience. Helena and Richard had departed Wisteria House the morning after the revelation, their honeymoon postponed, but their union strengthened by the ordeal they had shared. Helena's relief at the removal of suspicion had been profound, yet I detected in her manner a sadness for the friend whose betrayal had so nearly destroyed her happiness. The knowledge that Gerald's crimes had stemmed from desperation rather than malice, seemed to weigh upon her generous spirit. "And what of the Mallory family?" I inquired. "Will they recover from this scandal?" "Oh, the English upper classes, they possess a remarkable resilience in such matters," Poirot replied with a slight smile. "Sir James has already begun the process of restoring his family's reputation through charitable works and discreet philanthropy. Lady Mallory's skills as a hostess will ensure that Wisteria House continues to welcome distinguished guests. In time, this tragedy will become merely another chapter in the house's long history." As London's outskirts began to appear through our carriage windows, I found myself grateful for the return to familiar surroundings. Yet I could not dismiss entirely the memory of purple wisteria cascading across Georgian stone, or the image of that elegant library where friendship had been betrayed and justice ultimately served. "The little grey cells, Hastings," Poirot observed, noting my contemplative mood. "They serve not merely to solve mysteries, but to understand the complexities of the human heart. In this case, they revealed that the greatest crimes often spring not from evil, but from the failure to face one's own weaknesses with courage and honesty." The train pulled into Victoria Station with a great hiss of steam and grinding of brakes, returning us to the bustling anonymity of London life. Yet as we gathered our belongings and prepared to resume our ordinary existence, I reflected that the events at Wisteria House had reminded us once again that beneath the veneer of civilization, human nature remains as complex and unpredictable as ever, a truth that would continue to provide ample material for Hercule Poirot's remarkable detective abilities. Thanks for joining us for the mystery at Wisteria House. We hope this tale of secrets, suspicion,